Cleopatra VII ruled Egypt for 22 years successively in co-rulership with her brothers. They are also by tradition formal husbands, Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV, then, in de facto marriage to the Roman commander Mark Antony. She became widely known for her love affair with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Most of the ancient historiography is unfavorable to her. There is an opinion that the vilification of Cleopatra was carried out by the victor of Egypt Octavian and his entourage, who strove with all their might to slander the queen, presenting her not only as a dangerous enemy of Rome, but also as the evil genius of Mark Antony. However, some historians still believe that the lechery and cunning attributed to her were real. For example, a judgment about Cleopatra by the 4th century Roman historian Aurelius Victor has been preserved. She was so lecherous that she was often prostituted and possessed such beauty that many men paid with their death for possessing her for one night. Cleopatra was born in 69 before our era, apparently in Alexandria. She is one of the 3 daughters of King Ptolemy XII, possibly by a concubine, as Strabo notes that this king had only one legitimate daughter, Berenice IV. Cleopatra was characterized by powerful charm, attractiveness, perfectly used it to seduce, and in addition had an enchanting voice and a brilliant, sharp mind. Cleopatra clearly had a good education. Cleopatra became a true polyglot queen, knowing, in addition to her native Koine, Greek language, also Egyptian, Aramaic, ancient Ethiopian, ancient Persian, Hebrew, and the language of the Berbers, people who lived in the south of ancient Libya. Her linguistic abilities did not bypass Latin. Once in Egypt, Caesar attempted to replenish his coffers with debts that Ptolemy XII owed to the Roman banker Rabirius during his troubles to restore him to the throne, and which Caesar had now put on his own account. Soon after arriving in Alexandria, Caesar summons Cleopatra to his house in Alexandria. Getting into the capital, guarded by Ptolemy's men, was not easy. Cleopatra was helped to do it by her admirer, Sicilian Apollodorus, who secretly carried the queen in a fishing boat and then carried into Caesar's chambers, hidden in a large bed bag. Throwing herself at the feet of the Roman dictator, Cleopatra began to complain bitterly about her oppressors, demanding the execution of Pothinus. Pothinus was a eunuch, tutor to King Ptolemy XIII of Egypt, regent and de facto ruler of Egypt during his reign. The 52-year-old Caesar was captivated by the young queen. One thing is certain, she shared a bed with a Roman dictator and conquered him. Her husband realized in the morning that he had lost. He had started a hopeless war with Rome and died in it. The rebels were defeated on January 15, 47 before our era at Lake Mariot. While fleeing, King Ptolemy drowned in the Nile. This was followed by a joint voyage of Caesar and Cleopatra on the Nile on 400 ships, accompanied by noisy festivities. Cleopatra, formerly married to another of her minor brothers, Ptolemy XIV, effectively became the undivided ruler of Egypt under the Roman protectorate, guaranteed by the 3 legions left in Egypt. Shortly after Caesar's departure, June 23, 47, Cleopatra has a son who was named Ptolemy Caesar, but who went down in history under the nickname Caesarion given to him by the Alexandrians. It was said that he was very similar to Caesar in face and posture. Caesar went to war with King Pharnaces of Pontus, then with Pompey's last supporters in Africa. Immediately at the end of the wars, he summons Cleopatra to Rome, formally for an alliance between Rome and Egypt. Cleopatra was allocated Caesar's villa in his gardens on the banks of the Tiber, where she received noble Romans. The Republicans were extremely irritated by this and became one of the reasons that hastened the death of Caesar. There was even a rumor that Caesar is going to take Cleopatra, his second wife, and move the capital to Alexandria. However, Caesar's official will did not contain any mention of Caesarion, whom he thus did not dare to recognize as his son. Caesar was assassinated in a conspiracy on March 15, 44 before our era. A group of senators led by Gaius Cassius and Marcus Brutus organized a plot to assassinate Caesar and restore the Republic. At a Senate meeting in mid-March, the conspirators attacked the dictator with daggers and inflicted 23 wounds, from which he died on the spot. A month later, in mid-April, Cleopatra left Rome and arrived in Alexandria in July. Shortly thereafter, the 14-year-old Ptolemy XIV died. According to Josephus Flavius, he was poisoned by his sister. The birth of her son gave Cleopatra a formal co-emperor. In this situation, a maturing brother was completely superfluous to her. The war between Caesar's assassins, Cassius and Brutus on the one hand, and his successors Antony and Octavian on the other, required the queen to be cunning. The east was in the hands of Caesar's assassins. Brutus controlled Greece and Asia Minor, and Cassius settled in Syria. Cleopatra's governor in Cyprus, Serapion, helped Cassius with money and a fleet. With the queen's undoubted consent, Cleopatra outfitted the fleet ostensibly, as she later assured, to aid the Caesarians. In 42, the Republicans were defeated at Philippi. Cleopatra was 28 years old when she met 40-year-old Roman general Mark Antony. In the division of the Roman world, made after the defeat of the Republicans, Antony got the east. Antony decides to realize Caesar's project, a great campaign against the Parthians. Preparing for the campaign, he sends the officer Quintus Dellius to Alexandria to demand Cleopatra to himself in Cilicia. He was going to accuse her of helping Caesar's murderers, apparently hoping under this pretext to get from her as much money as possible for the campaign. Cleopatra, having learned through Dellius about the character of Antony and above all about his amorousness, vanity and love of external glitter, arrives on a ship with a gilded stern, purple sails and silvered oars. She herself sat in the garb of Aphrodite. On either side of her stood with Opehalami boys in the form of cupids and managed the shipmaids in the garb of nymphs. She then invites Antony to her palace for a sumptuous feast. Antony was completely enchanted. The queen easily dismissed the prepared accusations, saying that Serapion had acted without her knowledge and that she herself had equipped a fleet to help the Caesarians. But this fleet was unfortunately delayed by adverse winds. As a first show of courtesy to Cleopatra, Antony, at her request, ordered the immediate execution of her sister Arsinoe, who had sought refuge in the temple of Aphrodite at Ephesus. Thus began a romance that lasted 10 years, one of the most famous in history. Antony, leaving the army, followed Cleopatra to Alexandria, where he spent the winter 41 to 40 years before our era, indulging in drinking and entertainment. For her part, Cleopatra tried to bind him as tightly as possible. Plutarch tells us, "Together with him she played dice, together drank, together hunted, was among the spectators when he practiced with weapons. And at night, when he, in the dress of a slave, wandered through the city, stopping at the doors and windows of houses and showering his usual jokes owners, people of ordinary rank, Cleopatra and here was next to Antony, dressed to match him." From 37 to 36 before our era, Antony launched a campaign against the Parthians, which turned out to be a disaster, mainly because of the harsh winter in the mountains of Armenia and Mydia. Antony himself narrowly escaped death. Cleopatra remained in Alexandria, where in September 36 gave birth to a third child by Antony, Ptolemy Philadelphus. In Rome began to see the union of Antony and Cleopatra as a threat to the empire and to Octavian personally. Octavian sent his sister Octavia, Antony's lawful wife and mother of his two daughters, Antonia the Elder and Antonia the Younger, to join her husband in the early spring of 35. However, barely had she reached Athens, Antony ordered her to return immediately. This happened in the presence of Cleopatra, who threatened Antony with suicide if he accepted his wife. Antony wanted revenge for his defeat in the war with the Parthians. In 35, he captured the king of Armenia Artavasd II, made an alliance with another Artavasd, king of Mydia Atropatena, and made a triumph, but not in Rome, but in Alexandria, with the participation of Cleopatra and their joint children. A little later, Caesarion received the title of King of Kings. Alexander Helios was proclaimed King of Armenia and the lands beyond the Euphrates. Ptolemy Philadelphus received nominally, since he was about 2 years old, Syria and Asia Minor, and finally Cleopatra Selene II, Cyrenaica. The news of the distribution of lands caused great indignation in Rome. Antony still enjoyed considerable popularity in the Senate and army, but by his antics that defied Roman norms and traditional beliefs, he himself gave Octavian a weapon against himself. By 32, the matter had escalated to civil war. Octavian proclaimed it a war of the Roman people against the Egyptian queen. On the part of Antony and Cleopatra for the war was prepared fleet of 500 ships, of which 200 Egyptian. Antony led the war sluggishly, indulging together with Cleopatra feasts and festivities in all the Greek cities, and giving Octavian time to organize the army and fleet. While Antony was pulling troops to the west coast of Greece, about to cross into Italy, Octavian himself quickly crossed into Epirus and imposed Antony's war on his territory. Cleopatra's stay in Antony's camp, her constant intrigues against all those in whom she saw her detractors, served Antony badly, prompting many of his supporters to defect to the enemy. The defectors informed Octavian of the contents of Antony's will, and it was immediately taken from the Temple of Vesta and published. Antony officially recognized Cleopatra as his wife, her sons, his legitimate children, and willed to bury himself not in Rome, but in Alexandria, next to Cleopatra. Antony's will completely discredited him. Octavian, who was not a major military leader, found in Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa a competent commander who successfully waged war. Agrippa managed to drive the fleet of Antony and Cleopatra in the Gulf of Ambracian and blocked it. Cleopatra insisted on a naval breakthrough. The result was the naval battle of Actium on September 2nd, 31. When Cleopatra was afraid that victory was slipping away, she decided to flee with her entire fleet in an attempt to salvage something else. Antony also abandoned the battle and followed Cleopatra. Antony returned to Egypt and did nothing to continue the fight against Octavian. He wasted his energies in drunkenness and lavish festivities and announced with Cleopatra the formation of a union of mortals, whose members vowed to die together. Cleopatra tested poisons on the prisoners, trying to find out which poison brought a quicker and more painless death. Cleopatra was concerned about saving Caesarion. She sent him to India, but he later returned to Egypt. In the spring of 30, Octavian moved on Egypt. Cleopatra tried cruel measures to protect herself from treason. When the commandant of Pelusium, Seleucus, surrendered the fortress, she executed his wife and children. By the end of July, Octavian's troops appeared under the very Alexandria. The last parts of the troops remaining at Antony, one after another, went to the side of the winner. On August 1st, it was all over. Cleopatra, with her trusted maids Irada and Harmion, locked herself in the building of her own tomb. Antony was given false news of her suicide. Antony threw himself on his sword. Soon he, dying, was dragged into the tomb and died in the arms of Cleopatra, who sobbed over him. Cleopatra herself, clasping a dagger in her hand, showed her willingness to die, but entered into negotiations with Octavian's messenger. Apparently, Cleopatra still held out a faint hope of seducing Octavian, or at least negotiating with him and retaining the kingdom. Octavian was less amenable to seduction than Caesar and Antony. Cleopatra's last days are described in detail by Plutarch from the Recollections of Olympus, her physician. Octavian allowed Cleopatra to bury her lover, while her own fate remained unclear. She said she was ill and made it clear that she would starve herself to death, but Octavian's threats to kill her children forced her to accept treatment. Soon, the Roman officer Cornelius Dolabella, who was in love with Cleopatra, informed her that in 3 days she would be sent to Rome for Octavian's triumph. Cleopatra told him to give her a pre-written letter and locked herself in with her maids. Octavian received the letter, in which he found complaints and a request to bury her with Antony, and immediately sent men. The messengers found Cleopatra dead, in royal attire, on a bed of gold. Since before that, a peasant with a pot of fruit had passed to Cleopatra without arousing the suspicion of the guards, it was assumed that a snake had been carried in the pot for Cleopatra. It was claimed that 2 light bites were just visible on Cleopatra's arm. The snake itself was not found in the room, as if it immediately crawled away from the palace. According to another version, Cleopatra stored the poison in a hairpin. This version is supported by the fact that both of Cleopatra's maids died with her. It is doubtful that one snake could kill 3 people at once. Cleopatra's death on August 12th, 30th before our era, deprived Octavian of a brilliant captive at his triumph in Rome. The triumphal procession carried only her statue. Caesar's adopted son, Octavian, executed Caesar's own son by Cleopatra Ptolemy, the 15th Caesarion, in the same year. Children by Antony marched in chains in the Triumphalists' parade, then were given to Octavian's sister, Octavia, Antony's wife, in memory of her husband. For many years, the search for Cleopatra's tomb has continued. During the excavations, a statue of a woman who may have been the legendary Cleopatra was found. But despite the optimism, back in November 2006, Zahi Hawass told reporters, "We are looking for Cleopatra's tomb. Before us, no one has ever conducted a systematic search for the tomb of the last Queen of Egypt. Cleopatra's tomb, as well as Mark Antony's, has not been found yet. The search for the tomb of the doomed great lovers continues,